Give me my blanket. Shadow. Cookie. Can I have the ball? Can I have the ball? Oh, Shadow.